My son slammed the door in my face and told me never to come back. What he didn't know was that the house he shut me out of, I had secretly paid for it, down to the last cent. For 3 years, I watched from a distance as he raised his son in a home he believed he'd earned on his own. He never once wondered how the mortgage disappeared, never once asked who stepped in when the bank called. He thought I was just the father who disappeared. And maybe I was. But I never stopped trying to make things right, even if it meant doing it in silence. So when he told me I was no longer welcome, I didn't argue. I just walked away. But before I did, I left one letter behind. A letter that changed everything. If you've ever felt unseen, unthanked, or misunderstood, keep watching. Because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Walter Jenkins woke before dawn every morning, a habit carried over from the 4 decades he spent as an aerospace engineer. Even now, at 68, with nothing urgent on his schedule and no one expecting him, he brewed his coffee at 5:30 sharp, poured it into the same blue mug he had used since 1983, and sat in the silence of his Ohio home. It wasn't a grand place, but it was clean, organized, sterile almost, like a life measured in checklists and silence. The photos on the mantel were arranged chronologically, from his wedding day to the birth of his only son, Mark. Then the years grew sparse. No pictures of soccer games or birthdays, no graduation caps or father-son fishing trips. Just a gap. A visual echo of his absence. Walter had never meant to be absent. But the job had demands, deadlines, and consequences. In his mind, he was doing what was necessary. Providing, protecting, preparing a future. A man does what he must, he used to say to his wife, Linda, when she hinted at Mark's disappointment. Linda would nod, gently, but her eyes always looked tired. She passed away 10 years ago. Cancer. Quiet, cruel, and fast. Walter held her hand every night those last 2 months, read her old books aloud, and promised to look after their son. But looking after Mark had never come naturally. Their phone calls were brief, awkward. Walter asked about work. Mark answered in monosyllables. Holidays came and went without visits. On Mark's 30th birthday, Walter mailed a card and a check for $1,000. He never got a thank you, or a reply. 3 years ago, Walter overheard from a mutual friend that Mark and his wife Jessica were struggling to keep up with their mortgage. Jessica had recently been laid off, and Mark's consulting business was still unstable. They were considering selling the house and moving into a rental. Walter didn't hesitate. He contacted his lawyer, wired $137,000 to the bank, and ensured it would clear their debt entirely. He made one condition: anonymity. "I don't want them to know it came from me," he told his lawyer. "Just pay it, quietly." "Are you sure, Mr. Jenkins?" the lawyer asked. "They might want to thank whoever." "I'm sure. I don't want their gratitude. I want their peace." It was the most generous act of his life, and the loneliest. No one knew. No phone calls followed. No sudden invitations for dinner. Walter remained a ghost, watching from a distance as Mark posted photos of barbecues in the backyard, smiles with Jessica and their son, Nathan, playing in the very home Walter had saved. Not once did his name surface. Still, every Christmas, Walter sent a card. Every birthday, a gift. When Nathan turned 5, Walter mailed him a handmade wooden train set. He never saw the boy play with it. He never even knew if it arrived. He would sometimes dial Mark's number, stare at the screen, then press end before it rang. When he did call, Jessica usually answered. Her tone was cold, clipped, We're busy right now. Mark's not home. Try another time. Another time never came. Walter began taking long walks in the park near his house. He watched other fathers chase toddlers through the grass, push strollers, laugh. One day, he saw a man crouch down to tie his daughter's shoe and kiss her forehead. Walter turned away, ashamed at how unfamiliar that scene felt. One morning, while cleaning out an old drawer, he found a crumpled drawing Mark had made in first grade. "Me and Daddy at the zoo," scrawled in blocky letters. Walter couldn't remember that day. He wasn't sure if it had actually happened or if Mark had just imagined it. Either way, the guilt was overwhelming. That night, he wrote a letter to Mark but never mailed it. In it, he confessed everything. The years he had missed, the mortgage payment, the wish he could undo time. He folded it neatly and placed it in his desk drawer beside Linda's obituary. Days turned into months. He kept waiting for a sign that maybe, just maybe, Mark suspected that perhaps someone had told him. But nothing changed. The silence was as thick as ever. Then came a Tuesday afternoon that marked a year since Walter's anonymous payment. He called again. No answer. He tried Jessica's number. Voicemail. On impulse, he drove to their house, a tidy 2-story in a quiet neighborhood he had never been invited to. He parked across the street and just watched for a while. Mark raking leaves, Nathan kicking a soccer ball against the fence. Walter smiled softly. Then, mustering courage, he walked up the driveway. He rang the bell. The door opened just wide enough to reveal Mark's face. For a second, their eyes met. Then Mark's expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" Walter cleared his throat. "I thought I'd drop something off. For Nathan." Mark glanced behind him, then stepped outside and pulled the door nearly shut. "We've talked about this," he said. "Showing up like this, it's not okay." Walter blinked. "I haven't. I just wanted to see you. See him." "You were never around before," Mark said flatly. "Why now?" Walter opened his mouth, then closed it. "I think it's better if we keep things the way they are," Mark added. "Don't come back here, please." Then, without waiting for a reply, he shut the door. Walter stood there for a full minute, one hand still holding the gift-wrap box with Nathan's name on it. He left it on the doorstep and walked away, the wind cutting through his coat, the weight of silence pressing down harder than ever. The next Saturday morning, Walter stood outside Mark's house again, this time clutching a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a book Nathan might enjoy, a hardcover edition of The Velveteen Rabbit, with a handwritten note tucked into the front. "To Nathan, happy birthday, from Grandpa." It wasn't much, but Walter had spent nearly 20 minutes deciding between that and a science kit. Linda would have chosen the science kit. She always said their son had a curious brain. Walter had never known how to choose. The snow had begun falling as he stepped out of the car. It wasn't heavy yet, just a steady drift of white that coated the lawn and crunched beneath his boots. He adjusted his scarf, cleared his throat, and walked up to the front door. The lights were on. He could hear faint laughter inside. He rang the bell. Moments later, footsteps approached. The door opened. Mark stood in the doorway, his face expressionless, eyes tired. The warmth of the home and the sound of a child giggling floated through the gap. Walter smiled. "Happy birthday to Nathan," he said, holding up the gift. "I brought something for him." Mark didn't look at the box. "You didn't call." "I wanted it to be a surprise." Mark's jaw tensed. "We've asked you not to come unannounced. I just thought he'd like the book." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice colder than the wind around them, Mark said, "We don't need anything from you." Walter blinked. "I just wanted to." "I don't need you. I didn't then, and I don't now." And then he shut the door. Not slowly, not gently. A solid, final slam that echoed down the quiet street. Walter stood frozen for a moment, his hand still outstretched. The wrapped gift slipped from his fingers and landed softly in the snow. Across the street, a neighbor was walking their dog. They glanced over, awkwardly, then quickly looked away. Walter bent down, picked up the soggy package, brushed off the snow, and placed it gently on the doorstep. Then he turned and walked back to his car. He didn't cry. Not yet. The drive home felt longer than it was. He took the scenic route, winding through streets lined with bare trees and shuttered windows. When he arrived, he didn't go inside. He sat in the car with the engine off, watching his breath fog the windshield. This wasn't disappointment. It was something deeper. Final. That night, after 2 hours of staring at the TV without seeing a thing, Walter opened his desk drawer and pulled out the letter he had written months earlier. The one he never sent. His handwriting looked steadier back then, younger somehow. He read it twice. Then for the first time, he added something. Just one line, right at the bottom. "I wasn't there when you needed me, but I never stopped loving you." He folded the letter, placed it into a new envelope, and sealed it. The next morning, he called his lawyer. "I want you to send the documents," he said. "Everything. The bank transfers, the transaction receipts, all of it." The lawyer hesitated. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Walter stared out the window as the lawyer promised to handle it discreetly. "And this letter," he added, tapping the envelope on the desk. "It goes with the documents." He hung up, then stood in the middle of the room, uncertain of what he had just done. It felt like cutting open an old wound and handing it to someone else, but it also felt like the truth. And he was tired of hiding behind silence. Somewhere out there, his son was living in a house Walter had paid for, tucking his son into bed, building a life in a home built on a father's silent redemption. Walter didn't want thanks. He didn't even want forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, he wanted to be seen. Mark read the documents twice before he said a word. The numbers were irrefutable. The wire transfer from Walter's retirement account, the time-stamped bank receipt, the settlement letter from the mortgage lender. He held the papers in his hands like they were suddenly too heavy. Jessica watched him from across the table. "I told you," she said, her voice soft but edged. "I told you it wasn't some anonymous donor." Mark didn't look up. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" "Why wouldn't you ask?" she countered. "All those years. You never asked why the mortgage disappeared. You just assumed." He finally raised his eyes. "What was I supposed to assume? That the man who never showed up for anything suddenly decided to save us?" Jessica folded her arms. Maybe he was trying to show up in the only way he knew how. Mark scoffed, pushed the papers aside, and stood. "He doesn't get to buy his way back in." "This isn't about buying anything," she snapped. "This is about a man who was broken, trying to do one right thing." They argued for the better part of an hour. Mark's words were sharp, defensive. Jessica's were frustrated, wounded. At some point, Nathan tiptoed into the kitchen, heard the raised voices, and backed out silently. Later that night, after Jessica had gone to bed, Mark wandered into the garage. He didn't know what he was looking for. maybe space, maybe silence. But he ended up pulling down an old storage bin marked childhood. It had followed him through every move, from college dorm to first apartment, then finally here, to the house he thought he'd built without help. Inside were bent trophies, faded photographs, a cracked snow globe from a trip to the Grand Canyon. Near the bottom, wrapped in a rubber band, were school report cards and a few yellowed drawings. And then, a letter. He knew the handwriting immediately. It was his own. Unmistakably, 12 years old. He opened it carefully. The paper was creased, the ink slightly smudged. Dear Dad, I hope you're doing good at work. We're having a graduation at school next week, and I really want you to come. It's on Friday at 6. I know you're busy, but it would mean a lot. I saved you a seat. Love, Mark. His breath caught in his throat. He stared at the date. He remembered writing it, remembered placing it in an envelope and setting it on the kitchen counter for his mom to mail. He remembered checking the mailbox every day that week, hoping for a reply that never came. But here it was. Never mailed, never opened, still sealed. His hands shook. He turned it over and saw a note scrawled on the back in someone else's handwriting. His mother's. Don't bother. He won't show up anyway. Mark sat down hard on the garage floor. All this time. He remembered sitting in the front row that night at graduation, craning his neck toward the door every time it opened. He remembered the burning in his chest when the last student got their certificate and the seats next to him stayed empty. He remembered telling himself it was fine, that he didn't care. He did. And now he knew Walter had never even seen the invitation. A mix of anger, sadness, and guilt churned inside him. All these years he had blamed Walter for missing games, for never calling, for not caring. But what if Walter had never known? What if Mark's mother, in her quiet fury, had erased those small chances for connection? He stared at the old letter for a long time, then folded it carefully and slid it into his pocket. In the quiet of the house, he crept back to the kitchen and picked up the documents again. This time, he didn't just see numbers and bank seals. He saw the trembling hand that must have signed them. The man behind the transaction. A man who didn't know how to say, "I'm sorry." So he said it in silence, with his life savings. Mark leaned against the counter, eyes burning. It was never about the money. It was about a boy who felt abandoned and a man who didn't know how to come back. And both had been waiting for a letter that never arrived. The letter arrived on a Monday, in a plain white envelope with neat, almost formal handwriting. Walter stared at it for nearly 5 minutes before opening it. His name on the front. No return address. But he knew. Inside, the words were few, but they hit hard. Dad, I read everything. And I found something I should have read years ago. If you're willing, come to dinner this Saturday. Just us. Like a family. Mark. Walter didn't move for a long time. Then he read the letter again and again. He didn't respond. Didn't call. But when Saturday came, he shaved carefully, pressed a clean shirt, and arrived at Mark's house 5 minutes early, holding a bottle of wine he wasn't sure they'd even want. Jessica opened the door. She didn't smile, but she stepped aside to let him in. He's in the kitchen, she said. Nathan's at a sleepover. Walter nodded, removing his coat. The air between them was stiff, but not sharp, neutral. In the dining room, Mark was setting the table. He looked up, a mixture of nerves and relief flickering across his face. Hey, he said. Hey, Walter echoed. They sat down. The food was simple. roast chicken, potatoes, green beans. Walter noticed Jessica had made the same apple pie Linda used to bake. It made his chest ache. The conversation was cautious, like two people stepping through a minefield. Mark asked about Walter's health. Walter asked about Mark's work. There were long pauses, but no tension, just unfamiliarity. After dinner, they moved to the living room with coffee. Mark brought out an old photo album, and they flipped through pictures of Walter holding a baby-faced Mark, of Linda laughing beside a tent, of birthdays Walter barely remembered attending. Walter said little. He listened. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. As he stood to leave, Jessica offered to box up some pie for him. Walter smiled. That'd be nice. She walked into the kitchen. Walter lingered by the doorway, just out of sight. He didn't mean to overhear, but he did. She'll be thrilled, Jessica was saying into her phone, her voice low and sarcastic. Yes, the old man came, playing his part perfectly. We're clear after this. Just dinner, a slice of pie, and closure. There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. I've done my part. He got his moment. Mark can sleep at night now. Walter's body went cold. His fingers tightened on the edge of the doorway. He turned quietly, walked back into the living room, and waited. Jessica returned moments later, container in hand. Here you go. He took it, forced a thin smile, and nodded toward Mark. Thanks for dinner. It meant a lot. Mark stood, unaware of anything. We should do it again. Walter didn't answer. That night, back home, Walter sat in his armchair, the pie untouched on the counter. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. He wanted to believe in what he'd seen at dinner, the tentative reach of connection, the glimmer of healing. But Jessica's words echoed, harsh and sharp. Just dinner, a slice of pie, and closure. He thought of every call that went unanswered, every email that bounced back with cold replies. And now, it made a sick kind of sense. The emails hadn't been from Mark. They'd been from her. It was Jessica who had kept the silence alive, who had made sure Walter stayed on the outside, who had fed the resentment, pushed Mark to shut the door, played gatekeeper with an iron will cloaked in civility. Walter felt a bitterness rise, not rage, not even betrayal, just a deep, exhausted sorrow. He had been invited back, not as a father, but as an obligation. And somehow, that was worse than being ignored. Walter didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark of his living room, the silence louder than any storm, the pie Jessica packed sitting untouched on the counter. He had spent decades learning to endure silence, but this was different. This was chosen silence, his silence, and he realized it was time to use it. The next morning, he brewed coffee, wrote a short letter, folded it once, and slid it into an envelope with Mark's name on it. Then, without packing much, he began clearing the house. He didn't make announcements. He didn't call. He simply told the realtor to put the place up quietly, found a small cabin 2 towns over, and left. 2 days later, Mark found the letter in his mailbox. Mark, you don't have to forgive me. I was never the father you deserved. But I did love you. I still do. I used to think showing up late was better than never, but maybe I've shown up too many times when I wasn't wanted. So this is me stepping back. But before I go, I'll say this. Don't teach your son to hate someone who tried to love. I've made my mistakes. Let them end with me. Dad. Mark read the letter in his driveway. He didn't go inside. He just sat in his car for over an hour, staring at the paper. then out at the street, then back at the paper again. He remembered the way Walter had quietly stepped out of the dinner, how distant his voice sounded on the way out. Mark had thought maybe his father was just overwhelmed, but now he saw the truth. It hadn't been dinner. It had been goodbye. He wanted to talk to Jessica, to ask if what Walter overheard was true, but the questions felt too big, too raw, so he didn't. He just placed the letter in a drawer he rarely opened, next to the still-sealed envelope he found weeks before, the one he wrote when he was 12. Walter's house sold quickly, quietly. By the time Mark drove by 2 weeks later, the mailbox had a different name, the shutters were a new color, and the flower bed had been torn out. He knocked anyway. A young couple answered. They had just moved in. No forwarding address, no trace. He told them not to worry, said he was just a distant relative. Then he sat in his car again, longer this time, not even turning the engine on. A week passed, then another. Nathan, oblivious to the quiet storm in the household, asked one day after dinner, "When is Grandpa coming back?" Mark looked up. He's gone, buddy." "Gone like Grandma?" "No," Mark said gently. "Just far away." Nathan went quiet for a while, then nodded. "I wanted to tell him about my story. He used to like my stories." That night, Nathan disappeared into his room with a stack of crayons and a notepad. Mark didn't think much of it until he found the envelope by the front door the next morning. On it, written in crooked 7-year-old handwriting, "For Grandpa, I miss your stories. From Nathan." Mark stood there, holding the envelope like it was made of glass. Jessica walked in, paused when she saw it. He asked me if he could mail it. I told him I didn't have the address. Mark looked at her. "Neither do I." But something shifted in him. He didn't need an address. He needed to respond. He took Nathan to the post office. They asked if it had a destination. Mark said yes and made one up. Somewhere quiet, where the mail wouldn't be returned. A box to nowhere. A message to someone who might never read it, but needed to exist anyway. And maybe, just maybe, Walter would know. Somewhere in that small cabin, Walter sat on the porch with a blanket across his knees and a book resting in his lap. He watched the trees shift in the wind, listened to birdsong, and found peace in the smallest of things. He didn't have a phone, didn't want one. He had a radio, some books, and for the first time in years, no weight on his shoulders. A week later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was uneven. The words spelled wrong in places, but the message was clear. "Dear Grandpa, Mom says you're far away, but I miss your stories. I told Dad a new one last night, and he didn't laugh the way you do. I hope you're not sick. I hope you have books. Love, Nathan." Walter read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside his bed. He didn't write back. But that night, he read aloud from The Velveteen Rabbit, just in case the wind could carry his voice back to where it needed to go. The leaves had turned gold and red again, just like the year before. A quiet October morning, the kind where the air is crisp but not cold, and the sky is soft with light. Mark parked the car in front of the small care facility nestled between rows of tall trees. Nathan, now 8, sat beside him, swinging his legs and staring out the window. They hadn't spoken much on the drive. They didn't need to. Walter hadn't left a forwarding address, but the return on Nathan's letter gave Mark a clue. A small P.O. box in a rural town just 2 counties away. After a few quiet inquiries, he found the name of the facility. They had called ahead, asked if Walter was well enough for visitors. The nurse said he'd be happy to see them. Mark didn't bring flowers or gifts, just a bag of vanilla ice cream cups and 2 plastic spoons. When they walked in, Walter was on the porch in a rocking chair, blanket over his knees, eyes closed, but not asleep. He opened them slowly at the sound of footsteps. Mark didn't speak. Neither did Walter. Nathan stepped forward first. "Hi, Grandpa." Walter smiled, slow and warm. "Hey, kiddo." They sat together on the porch, the 3 of them, unwrapping the ice cream cups and eating in silence. Mark glanced sideways once, saw his father watching Nathan eat, the corner of his mouth twitching into the faintest smile. Vanilla. It had always been Mark's favorite as a boy. Walter remembered. Mark looked down at his spoon. "You used to take me out for ice cream after doctor visits," he said quietly. Walter nodded. "You always picked vanilla? Said chocolate was too loud." Nathan giggled. That was it. No apology. No unpacking of old grief. Just that. A shared memory. A quiet acknowledgement that time had passed. And maybe not all of it was wasted. They stayed for an hour. Talked about school. Books. Nothing heavy. As the sun began to dip, Walter leaned back in his chair, eyes closed again. "You coming back?" he asked. Nathan looked up. "Yeah. Can I bring you a story next time?" Walter didn't open his eyes. "I'd like that." Mark placed a hand gently on his father's shoulder before they left. Walter didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. Outside, as they walked to the car, Nathan asked, "Was that goodbye?" Mark shook his head. "No," he said. "That was hello." 2 years later, in early spring, Walter passed in his sleep. The staff said he went peacefully, with a book on his chest and the letter from Nathan folded inside. The funeral was simple, quiet. Just a few old colleagues, some neighbors from the facility, and 2 generations of his family sitting in the front row. Mark stood to give the eulogy. He hadn't prepared a speech. He didn't need one. "My father wasn't perfect," he began. "He missed things, big things. And for a long time, I held on to that, like it defined him." He paused. "But the older I got, the more I realized, sometimes love doesn't look like presents. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice, like silence, like letting someone else believe you weren't there, because you thought that was better." His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. "He paid off our house without ever asking to be thanked. He sent letters he never got answers to. And he sat quietly on the porch, waiting for someone to come back. He spent a lifetime paying a debt he thought he owed." Mark looked down at the casket. "He didn't owe me anything, but he gave anyway." There was no music, no slideshow, just the wind through the trees and the soft murmur of those gathered. After the service, Nathan walked to the headstone and placed a folded piece of paper at the base. "I brought you a new story, Grandpa," he said. "It's about a dragon who hides treasure in the snow, but not because he's greedy, because he wants someone brave enough to find it." He paused, then added, "I'll come visit." Walter never heard the words, but somewhere in the breeze, in the shifting of leaves, there was something like an answer.